Welcome to T is for Trauma. I'm your host, David O'Connor. My guest today is Becca DeRoeck, who, like Melanie Robinson in episode 2, is somebody I've gotten to know this year through the mentorship program we're both a part of, Explore Austin. In this episode, Becca talks about what it was like to emigrate from her native Sweden to the US at age 10, how developing an anxiety disorder during college would undermine her relationship with the man she wanted to marry, being hospitalized from a misdiagnosed disease that spirals so far out of control that her family thought they were going to lose her, then going to find herself while working abroad in Europe, leading her to eventually reconnect with her lost love. Becca's story is really beautiful, and it was a real honor to have her sit down and share it with me. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Becca DeRoeck. Becca, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me. I like to always start off with gratitude and express appreciation for people taking the time to come here, share their stories. And the question that I wanted to start with is one that I have also asked other Explore Austin mentors, which is what drew you to the program and how have you found it so far?
Yeah, I love that question. I'm super passionate about this organization, and I kind of found it by chance. I was previously a volunteer with an organization called Verde Leaders, formerly known as Upper 90. So it's an after-school soccer program that was then absorbed by the 4ATX Foundation. Sorry, I keep touching the mic. The 4ATX Foundation with Austin FC. And so I volunteered with them right before the pandemic. And then obviously the pandemic kind of put the kibosh on a lot of that. And so afterward, I moved roles and I was in a more demanding sort of, job. And so it was harder to commit to like 1 to 2 days a week to go and play soccer with the kids.
Right.
And when I do things, I want to go all in. And so I didn't feel right doing it half-heartedly. And so I was just kind of Googling different organizations in Austin, and Explore Austin popped up. And it just sounded like such a perfect fit because I've always loved the outdoors, and I grew up in a place that's very rich in nature in Sweden. And so for me, I think the meaning behind it has been getting to share with kids that are either in, pretty difficult situations in a lot of cases, not in all cases, but certainly in some, and just getting to pour into them and be an example, but also letting them be an example for me. I think it can be so powerful and can really teach children like how empowered they can feel right in their lives. And so it's been really, just an amazing experience from beginning to end for me.
Nice. Yeah, I think really like that compounding effect where just showing up for somebody at a very tender age can have such a huge impact further down the road. And also the inverse of that of not having somebody show up leading to very negative outcomes.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I feel like in my life, I didn't necessarily have, a lot of mentors growing up, but I guess I was always a bit of a teacher's pet. So I kind of had a built-in adult mentor in that sense. But yeah, I agree. I think for me, moving from Sweden to the US was somewhat of it was a big deal. And, a lot of the kids that we work with Explore Austin also come from similar backgrounds in terms of being from bilingual households.
Right.
Maybe having moved or having grown up just in a different situation. And so I think it's, I have like a natural kinship, I think, with them just by having experienced something somewhat similar.
Yeah. Were you already quite outdoorsy before joining the program, or were you hoping this would bring it out of you?
I've always been quite outdoorsy. I think that's, I grew up like playing outside in a forest behind my house in Sweden and playing in wheat fields and picking mushrooms, and all of that really, I think, has informed how I experience the world today, and I'm very grateful for that. But I wasn't ever like someone who would just go and camp, right? Or my parents would take us to, parks, or we would go like do long road trips, but it was never like, let's go sleep on the ground for fun. And so I think I always wanted to be that person. And I did like a camping trip in high school with like a church youth group where we hiked for 6 days out in the mountains in Colorado. And even though it was like more religious in terms of the focus, it was very, I think, transformational for me, just understanding what I'm made of, and I can do something that's physically really challenging, but mentally also exhausting, right? You're pushing yourself to your limits in a lot of ways. And so that was, I think, a big piece of why I wanted to join this program as well, having experienced something similar myself when I was that age.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because it seems like a lot of people that I talk to in the program, they have that similar experience of their parents tried to instill camping into them when they were young and they had no interest. But now as an adult, it's like, oh, I'm going to go spend my free time, even though I didn't enjoy this as a child. It's usually the other way around.
Well, yeah, and I think for me, like, my parents never did camp, right? So it was more so like me wanting to be out in nature, but not feeling equipped. Like, we would sleep in the backyard on occasion and like, you know, do like the fry hot dogs and stuff like that. It's very just amateurish, I guess.
It's still fun.
Yeah. It was great.
So you mentioned growing up in Sweden. Where in Sweden did you grow up?
In a small town outside of Stockholm. So it's like literally the last stop for, not the subway, but I guess the train from Stockholm. It's pretty rural. It's one of those places where you come back and nothing has really changed, or not a lot has. So it's always a bit of a time warp when I go back and visit. My grandparents are still there. But yeah, I think for me, it did have a big sort of part in my life, even though I lived there till I was 10. So I was born and raised there. But it was also, I think, just being close to nature in that way for me. Yeah, it's always been important. And I think moving to the U.S. was especially hard because, again, like, we came to California initially in the Bay Area, which was sort of like a concrete jungle. Not a ton of, I mean, there was nature nearby, but it wasn't something that I really got to experience in the same way. So
yeah, what was that experience like of moving at age 10? Because that itself is a very transitionary time.
Yes.
So what was that like to? Well, first of all, what was the catalyst for moving from Sweden?
Yeah. I hesitate to use the word traumatic, but it was a little traumatic at that age. So the impetus for moving was my dad got a promotion essentially to go and start as the director of business development for a semiconductor company. It's a Swedish company, but then they decided to open an office in the Bay Area. It was kind of right around the time, it was in 2000, so right around the time that tech was really booming. You know, and so we decided at that point, after living in Sweden, because my dad's American, so he met my mom in Bible school in Scotland, and then they decided to make the move to Sweden, which was very hard for my dad, having been a native Virginian. And so I think eventually he was like, okay, it's my turn now. I want to get out of the snow and the cold. And so we made the move to California.
Was this before or after the .com crash?
It was after.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think, like just after. It was in 2000, like late 2000.
Yeah. So what was that experience like for you? Well, first of all, how good was your English when you arrived?
Yeah, I definitely still had a bit of an accent. So my parents, I went to a Christian private school in Sweden, and my parents, I think my mom, grew up visiting England, and half of her family is in New Zealand, and so her English was quite good, and both my parents are linguistics majors. So I think by virtue of that, it was kind of baked in that I would have an easier time picking up on the language.
Right.
So I grew up speaking Swedish with my mom, and then pretty much entirely English with my dad, even though he knows and is fluent in Swedish. It was so that we could learn and become fluent within short order. But right before we moved, we got a little bit of tutoring from a British tutor. So he gave us some good, a bit of a head start, I should say.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was good.
And what was it like acclimatizing to that environment? Like, was it easy to fit in?
It was tough. I think change has always been a bit difficult for me, and I remember feeling very betrayed by my parents and acting out in various ways. Like, I've always been a bit of a rule follower and a goody two shoes, so it wasn't anything too extreme. But I just remember feeling, very upset because obviously I had deep roots in Sweden, and I had grown up visiting Virginia and the East Coast where my dad's family's from, but I'd never been to California, and it just felt like such a far cry from where I grew up. And we moved into like a 2-bedroom apartment, so I shared a room with both of my sisters, and it was just it was a very different world. That being said, we were also in a world of a lot of other transplants who came from Europe. There was a French couple in our neighborhood and their children, a Scottish family and their kids, and my best friend in elementary school was Korean. And so I think by virtue of the Bay Area being sort of a transitory place, I was able to fit in a different way because there were a lot of other children who had a similar experience to mine. But it was still difficult.
Yeah, I'd imagine.
Yeah.
It's funny. I had a very similar experience as an adult in Seattle, which I would say broadly is quite a cliquey place. And most of the transplants end up hanging out with the transplants just because it's tough to break in and do cool Seattle stuff with those people. So yeah, I can relate to an adult version of that.
Yeah, no, I get that. It's definitely something that I think forces you to adapt very quickly, for sure.
Yeah. How long did you guys spend in California?
We spent 3 years there. So we knew it was going to be short term. And just, again, it was sort of an in-between phase where my dad was getting established in terms of his career. And then he had the opportunity to move to Texas because he had clients in Texas. So we were essentially the first wave of California transplants. I mean, maybe not the first, but, it was kind of before everything took off in such a huge way. And that, I remember, was also difficult because, again, it felt like, okay, yet another uprooting. And then coming to Texas, it was nice because, one, we were kind of out in a more rural setting, and so it definitely felt a little bit less extreme than living in an apartment in the middle of San Jose. But I think there it was also harder because, similar to Seattle in your experience, people had lived in this town. I lived in Georgetown, which is where I am now, which is just outside of Austin. And it was at the time, like, I think less than 20,000 people. It's now upward of 70,000, I think, and one of the fastest growing cities in America. Wow. And so at the time there was like one Walmart. There was like nothing else. It was one Walmart and like an H-E-B.
What more do you need?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
That's everything covered.
Just those two things. That's it. And a McDonald's, of course. And so I just remember feeling like it was harder to break in then with other friends. And, luckily for me, I've always been a floater. Like, I don't fit squarely and neatly into any one grouping of like I was pretty sporty and athletic. So I kind of had a natural in through that, I think, which was fortunate. But I was also very nerdy, and so I could kind of like move between a couple different groups. But a lot of these folks had known each other since they were in elementary school, and so it was just like, trying to break into this group of kids that had known each other for most of their lives.
Right, yeah, you're the new kid.
Right,
yeah.
You're the new kid on the block.
Do you think that kind of ability to be a chameleon, was that natural, or do you think that was born out of necessity?
It's a great question, and I wonder about that in myself, right? Like, I actually recently did a personality test. It's called 16 Personalities. It's very similar to Myers-Briggs. And my personality type, I would say, is more leaning extroverted. And I think for me, even though change is very difficult, I still think, adapting does come pretty naturally for me. And I also think that's because I come from a very multicultural family, right? Yeah. My mom's side of the family is from New Zealand and Sweden. My dad's side of the family is Amish and Mennonite. They literally, removed themselves from Switzerland due to religious persecution in, the, I think, 1600s.
Wow.
So I feel like our family has always had this theme of, kind of being on the move and, just being able to fit in and be a chameleon in whatever environment. So.
Yeah. And then where did you go to college?
I went to college right here in Austin.
Okay.
UT Austin, yeah.
What did you major in?
The most generic thing you can major in, which is communication studies with a focus on human relations, which is very me. And I was never one of those people that was like, I'm going to be a doctor or a lawyer. I did think at one point in 8th grade that I was going to become a cop, which now I realize is definitely not in my nature. Like, I'm a conflict avoider. So I think that would have been hard. I do like mediating, and I'm a bit of a peacekeeper in my family in general. But I think it would have been difficult. I also can't stand the sight of blood, so there's that. So after graduating high school, I was kind of unclear on what I wanted. And, I kind of saw communication. I was like, I'm a good communicator. I'm all right. This feels like a soft field that appeals to me. So I went for it, and I'm very grateful because I think even though it wasn't maybe the most challenging major I could have gone into, I do think it landed me where I am today, and it allowed me to explore, I lived at home all through college. So my experience was a little bit unique in that I didn't fully integrate as a college student in the ways that a lot of other people do. But I think I also was at a point in my life where I didn't want such a huge change, and I was kind of grandfathered into, there's this 10% program. So the top 10% of high school students in Texas are automatically admitted into UT Austin, and I was one of those. And so it was kind of a clear choice of I don't want to spend money to go out of state. Yeah. Tuition's really expensive. And so anyway, long story short.
Yeah. At that point, did things feel more natural? Did you feel like a Texan?
I did, yeah. I think it was interesting because in California, I never truly felt at home. And I think it's because, again, people were always coming and going. Versus when I came to Texas, I think within 2 years, it was pretty immediate. Okay, this is my home, and these are my people. And it just felt more natural. So, yeah.
And then again, with college, it's kind of like that somewhat transitory environment where you have people from a lot of different cultures, places coming together. So, and I'm sure that also helped.
It did, yeah. And I think at that point, I had the safety blanket of still living at home and having that, I could ease into independent life in a way that I think not every college student can, and I'm very grateful for that because I'm very sensitive. And so I was like, I need time to get used to this new reality of being an adult.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And I'm curious, just real quick, I guess it probably was not as easy at the time with the internet, but did you keep in contact with anybody in California or Sweden?
Yeah, great question. I remember a lot of my schoolmates in Sweden, they sent me off with a bunch of letters, and there was 1 or 2 friends that I think we wrote letters back and forth. I'm old.
Yeah, pen pals.
Pen pals back in the day before cell phones
kids
were
these days don't know.
Yeah, they don't know. The Gen Zers. No, is it Gen Z? Yeah, Gen Z. The Zoomers among us. And so, yeah, I didn't actually end up keeping in touch with a lot of people. I think for sure once Facebook came around in 2006, I think I would reconnect very briefly, but it wasn't anything lasting, which is, kind of typical for social media.
Yeah. I mean, it's also just tough to sustain those relationships,
exactly.
Right? Everybody's in a very different place at that point, both figuratively and literally.
Totally.
So, in college, you met your now husband?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
How did you guys meet?
So throughout the latter half of high school and all through college, actually, I worked part-time at IKEA, the Swedish furniture store. I was a shoo-in, clearly, because of my Swedish heritage. I actually was referred in by a fellow high school classmate. So I worked in the cooking and eating department,
Ooh.
and my husband worked in the cash lanes as a cashier. And I just remember, like, I had already worked there, I think, for like 2 years, and then he started working there. And this would have been, I think I was a sophomore at that point in college, freshman or sophomore. And I just remember seeing him and thinking he was really cute. And I was actually friends with the person that brought him into the company and referred him. And so I like started like, putting some feelers out of like
Asking some questions.
Yeah, I was like, I like this guy. He's cute. And then I remember he would like come through with the yellow bags. So yellow bags at IKEA, if you're not aware, you just, pick one up when you're shopping and you reuse it and then you put it in a bin at the end of the store. So he would come and collect the yellow bags, and he would always stop in my department, and we'd chit chat. And I just remember being like, okay, this guy's awesome. And then we'd talk in the parking lot or, on breaks, whatever. And we just kind of went on like that for, I guess, about a year before we actually started dating. Because he always thought that I was like, I don't know, I was very independent, and he thought I was like just, a big flirt, I think. I was like, no, I'm serious about this guy. And yeah, so that was how we initially met.
He also did not grow up in the U.S., right?
He did, but his grandfather, similar to me actually, came over from Belgium when he was around 10 years of age. Yeah.
Okay.
So.
Did you guys connect on that at all?
A little bit. I think his grandfather actually hit his head really hard when he came to the U.S. So he didn't remember. Like, he lost his language. So he lost.
Whoa.
Yeah, it was kind of crazy. So a lot of his memories and things from that time are kind of lost.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Pretty nuts.
Yeah. Okay, so if we fast forward a little bit, you started to develop some anxiety.
Yes.
And I mean, I can hand the floor over to you if you want to start to tell that story and unpack that.
Sure. Yeah. So when my now husband and I dated, then boyfriend, essentially I was still going to UT Austin. He decided he was going to go to Oral Roberts University in Oklahoma. Part of what we connected over was our very religious upbringings.
Right.
And at that point, both of us were still considered ourselves Christian, and, we're kind of abiding by that sort of perspective and approach to life. And he felt called at the time to go and study at Oral Roberts University in Oklahoma. And so, of course...
Can I just ask, for context, as an outsider, I'm going to assume that's a religious school?
Yes. Yeah,
okay.
Sorry. Yes, it's a very conservative religious school in Oklahoma. Actually, my grandmother visited there, I think in the 80s or something, my Swedish grandmother. So it was all kind of funny full circle things.
Yeah.
And so we, of course, had just started dating when he made that decision, it was like 2 weeks in at that point.
Wow.
Yeah. And so, he made that jump. And it's not like it's so far. It was like an 8-hour drive, but still, we're in two very different cities and places. And so we dated long distance for, several months, for about 9 months in total. And we got to a point where, and I think this happens a lot, and I actually studied this as part of my communication degree, long distance relationships. I took like a whole course about it.
Really?
Yeah, it was fascinating. I don't remember a lot of it, but the gist is essentially, I think you tend to romanticize the other person more so than if you're in person with them.
Yeah.
Because again, you're daydreaming about them, and you build up like what that will be when you meet each other again. And you're, talking on the phone, and you just don't have that same experience of being in person.
Right. It's like social media, right? Like you're only seeing that person's highlights.
Yes.
And, if someone's in a bad mood or they don't want to talk to you, they just don't talk to you. Whereas like if you're living with someone or hanging out with them multiple times a week, you got to see the full spectrum.
Yeah, exactly. And I think for us, I was kind of needy at the time. And I remember like he was figuring out like his situation in school and being away from home. And his family. And so I remember just like I started getting anxious when like if he wouldn't respond right away. Like at that point I had like a little Nokia phone. We would text message and call and stuff. So I think that's where my anxiety kind of began. And then towards the end of I guess my sophomore year, right before the summer started, I started getting some weird symptoms of like I lost weight. I just didn't have much of an appetite. And I started getting anxious, and I think a lot of it came down to like, we had started talking more seriously about like marriage, and he was going to drop out essentially at that point during the summer or right before the summer, and then come back to Austin so that we could be together, instead of being long distance. And he also just didn't feel like at that point, I think he fell out of thinking that Oral Roberts was the right step for him, and he was like, this doesn't feel like the right education or like a good education for me. And so in making that decision, I think there was on a subconscious level for me, because I hadn't really, that was my very first relationship. I hadn't experienced a lot at that point in my life. So I think partially it was fear of like, oh shoot, like things are going to change. And as I've described, change is not my forte. And then at the time I also had, this is kind of a weird side part of the story, but I had a professor that was like hitting on me. And so that made me anxious as well, and kind of made me feel like, okay, am I like this just feels very weird.
And you're like 20 at this point?
Yeah, I think I was 20, 19 or 20.
Yeah.
And so all that wrapped together, I remember very clearly I was sitting at home on the couch, and David had just driven back from Oklahoma, and he was coming back, and I saw him, and I just got this like anxious feeling in my stomach. And I was still feeling sick, right? Like physically ill, but I didn't know, there was no diagnosis. It was like, well, you just have anxiety, and you're feeling nauseous because of anxiety and stuff like that. And so he was like, well, I'll run to the store and I'll get you some Sprite and Tums and you'll be fine. And he left. And then as he was coming back, like, it was like I saw his car pull up, and I just immediately ran to the bathroom and threw up. And it was so bizarre, because it was like almost in that moment where my physical symptoms and the anxiety that I was experiencing became very closely interrelated to our relationship. And I still don't understand it to this day. I don't know how to explain it to people without sounding totally crazy. But something in my brain at that point was like, oh shoot, like David arrives, you throw up, these two things are now correlated. And so anytime after that, he would come around or we would try to hang out, I would get really sick and I would get nauseous, and it was really hard for me to just like be with him. And so, I tried to explain, what was happening, and I couldn't explain it because I had no idea what was happening in my body. It just presented as extreme anxiety to the point of, vomiting. And so after a while, we took some time apart. And then one morning I remember waking up and I had I think they were just burst blood vessels under my eyes, but it looked like I had 2 black eyes. And at that point I had also lost, I think 15 to 20 pounds. And it just kind of happened so gradually that I didn't even really notice until I looked at the mirror and I was like, oh my God, what is happening?
The black eyes, was that from vomiting or was it just malnourishment?
It could have been both. So my mom took me to the doctor that day, and they didn't know. They didn't really understand why that happened exactly. I suspect it's probably from the kind of physical strain of all those things coming together. And so I met with a doctor, and she was like, well, we need to get you hospitalized right away. We don't know exactly what's happening, but there's something more going on here than what we're seeing. And so it started with doing some tests and looking at, blood count and all those things. They did a bone marrow biopsy, which is basically where they do a and surgery just to make sure that it's not cancer.
Yeah.
So that was scary and very uncertain. And all the while, I kept thinking about David, my now husband, my then boyfriend, and thinking how am I going to explain this? I don't know what's happening. It was just all very intense.
Yeah.
And so finally, they ran a test that told them that it was a very severe case of mono. And at the time, I was still working at IKEA. I was like lifting heavy wooden pallets. And like one of the things with severe cases of mono is that your spleen can rupture if it goes undiagnosed long enough. And so I was kind of at that point where, and that's partially why like they had to put me on a really strong dose of steroids to fight the infection. And it's one of those things that most of the time is caught early enough, and so it doesn't get that severe. But for me, it had gotten very severe because it had gone untreated for so long. And so I spent about 4 days in the hospital just, kind of getting treated. And like, even looking back, I remember like my sisters told me after, they were like, yeah, Mom told me to say goodbye to you because she wasn't sure like if that was going to be the last time. And it was just like, I didn't feel like I was on my deathbed, and I don't know like truly how close that was, but looking back, like, yeah, like I had lost so much weight. I still couldn't eat very well because, again, I would have these intrusive thoughts thinking about like, my relationship and what was happening, and that would bring back all the anxiety. So it was like I would just sit there in the hospital bed with waves of anxiety. And so I'm going to pause.
Was the nausea still happening at that point when you were in the hospital?
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was.
So it was just a constant in your life at that point.
It was a constant. Yeah, it was like I had to distract myself, and even if, like, I remember, I think at that point I had already. I'm trying to remember if I had changed my number at that point, but it had gotten so bad before I was hospitalized to the point where, like, anytime David would text me, I would get a wave of anxiety and nausea, and I would throw up.
Yeah.
Which is so crazy that your mind has that much power over you, that somebody reaching out to you can cause that sort of reaction. And so being in the hospital, my parents were, of course, really concerned and wanted to make sure that I could, like, bounce back and overcome that sickness. And they noticed, like, anytime I would get worse, it was because I was thinking about him, or like trying to reach out or like explain things that I barely understood myself at that point. And I kept putting myself in his shoes of like, and trying to be empathetic of like, he obviously has no clue what's happening. And I've tried to explain, but how do you explain that, like, anytime you come around, I feel like throwing up?
Yeah.
It's a very hard message to deliver.
It feels very personal.
Right. It's like, oh, well, what? And so my sister ended up like emailing him and telling him like, hey, Becca's in the hospital. She's not doing well right now. Like, she just needs space. And so I think that's where, again, the anxiety just kind of got connected and tied up in the idea of a relationship. Not just that relationship, but every relationship after that presented similar symptoms.
Yeah. Also, at the time, had your studies suffered? Like, were your grades affected by this as well?
Luckily, it was during the summer, so I was on summer break. So it was kind of good timing, I suppose, in that, I was able to rest at home. And my job was, like, I worked at IKEA still part-time, and I had a lot of flexibility, thankfully, to, like, take the time I needed to recover and get better. And, I think as soon as I was able to, like, kind of get to the point where I could eat more comfortably again, and it just really took a very long time and a concerted effort for me to mentally pull myself out of, like, what about David? Like, how is he feeling? And, like, focus on myself. And that was really hard because obviously it's like someone I loved and wanted to marry at some point, and thought I wanted to marry, and it just felt so confusing. And that, I think, was the most traumatic part was, he would say, well, can't we just be friends? And I'm like, I cannot be around you. I can't communicate with you without feeling these horrible symptoms and feeling sick. And I think that was the hardest part.
So, what time frame are we talking about here? Like, start to finish?
Yeah. So I would say from, like, the onset of, like, symptoms and trying to figure out what it was, it probably started in, like, April. And then so it went on for about 2 or 3 months until they finally figured out what it was. So I think probably around, like, June or July, and then was in the hospital. I can't remember the exact timing, and then I would say within like 6 to 8 months, I finally was back to like some semblance of normal, where I was like able to eat and like function in a better way.
Yeah. Did you start to regain weight at that point?
I did, yeah. Thankfully. It definitely took time, and my weight would yo-yo a bit depending on like, because I believe it was my junior year in college. I tried dating somebody again, and it was the same sort of thing where I would get really anxious, and like, you know, when you're dating someone that's like, oh, let's go grab food, and I would always be like, I don't want to do that because I might throw up, and I don't feel like eating because I'm so nauseous all the time.
Yeah.
And it just was so bizarre because, again, I had no reason to be anxious around this new person.
Yeah.
It was really just like my body at that point had gotten used to that, and mentally it just, that connection was so strong between relationship bad will cause death, right? Like it was kind of like very clear.
Yeah. So what happened next?
So yeah, I continued my studies. I graduated college in 2012, and you know, throughout that time I definitely improved. I went to therapy. I got on medication, which was difficult because I'm very petite, and so medication for me, I had very strong side effects, and I just felt kind of zombie-ish and not great, and it didn't actually really do much to dull the anxiety. And I think in my senior year I tried dating somebody else that I also met at IKEA at the time, and again, kind of similar scenario. Like he was studying, and I'm actually just now connecting how this was similar, but we started seeing each other, and then he ended up moving back to Houston to finish his studies. And again, similar thing, like this was somebody I had really strong feelings for, and then I started getting those same like horrible symptoms and couldn't really be around him. And at the time I had just applied for this program with IKEA called Backpacker, and it was like a people development and leadership development program. And so I graduated from college. I didn't know what I wanted to do next, so I continued working at IKEA at that point full time. And then I knew that this program was happening, and it was one where you have to like go through a series of interviews, and they essentially selected, I think it was out of 60 applicants, 8 people from the US to go abroad and work on 2 different projects in different countries. And it was supposed to be aligned to like what you wanted to focus on in your career. So for me, it was HR and marketing at the time.
Yeah.
And so once I got selected into that program, and it was clear like, okay, I'm going to be leaving. I was going to spend 6 months in Belgium and 6 months and 6 months in Poland. I, at that point, I just kind of made the decision of like, okay, I don't think I can do another long distance thing. I was already, again, struggling so much with anxiety and vomiting. And I was like, I can't go away on this again, it was a big change for me. It was the first time I would ever live away from home. And of course it was like halfway across the world.
Yeah.
I do this to myself. And so I ended up, ending the relationship, and basically like we were gonna like keep in touch and try to make it work. And the anxiety became so severe that I like literally the night before I was like up vomiting.
Wow.
And, I tried taking Xanax and all these different things, but nothing helped. And so I just gave up, and I was like, well, I'm sorry, like I can't do this. And I left, and I moved to Belgium. And in Belgium, I continued to struggle with anxiety. I think for me, it was actually the way that I think partially managed some of those traumatic things is also by like throwing myself into something completely different and challenging myself in a new way. And that's kind of what this was. It was kind of like a Hail Mary, a little bit of like, okay, well, I want to not to escape necessarily what was happening in Austin, but at the time, like I remember driving down I-35, and like I would see a car that looked like David's old car, and I would get really anxious. And so there were all these like places and things that would kind of bring that anxiety back for me.
Yeah.
And so I think part of me was like, well, if I leave and go somewhere else, I won't have those same associations. And of course, anxiety follows you, just like depression or any other mental anguish. You can't outrun that. And so I continued to struggle with it, but I still put myself out there, and I made new friends, and it was a really amazing and transformational experience for me, but also one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. So.
Yeah. And I'm curious, after the mono diagnosis and then working with a therapist, and also it sounds like maybe a psychiatrist, was there any insight into what might be causing the symptoms or just the general feeling of anxiety?
There was a lack of answers,
Yeah.
is how I'll put it. I think, I think the main thing, and I already knew this, like I'm pretty self-aware, and I kind of was able to intuit like, okay, this is just my brain having power over my body in a way that I can't control. And I think that's the case for most mental illness. And so therapists would really focus on like, well, let's try to get at the root of those like intrusive thoughts that bring up the anxiety, because part of why the anxiety continued even after I ended that relationship was anytime I would think about him or think about like, I guess things that were even good in our relationship, and I would kind of think back to those things, I would feel that anxiety. And sometimes I would even like test myself by having, like, I would think about it and then I would be like, okay, is that going to bring up anxiety if I think about this? So it was like I was constantly like putting myself through that same cycle of anxiety by like constantly testing, like, okay, am I okay now? Can I think about this again? And so, yeah, there was no real like one answer. It was more like, let's treat the thoughts and let's figure out like how to get at the root of the anxiety you're feeling. But I think a lot of the tactics that I was given, I wasn't in the state to be able to absorb those tactics.
Yeah. Was there a particular modality of therapy that you pursued or modalities?
A lot. I think it was cognitive behavioral therapy. So it was a lot of like, let's focus on redirecting your thoughts. Let's focus on like, in the moment, can you breathe and can you tune into your body and those sorts of things. And it was so physical for me. The symptoms were so physical, right? Like throwing up, that's about as physical as it gets, right? And so as soon as that feeling would creep up in my stomach, I knew it was over. It was like, why even fight it? Like, I know this is going to happen. I know I'm going to feel better afterward because, of course, I think it's, I don't think it's oxytocin. It's
Serotonin.
Serotonin or endorphins, I think, are released when you vomit. So I know way too much about this stuff. And so I always knew like I would feel better after, which I think like the reason, there's bulimia and other things that are tied into this, but I didn't have that, but it was, again, similar where your mental state dictates how your body reacts. And that's what was happening in my case.
Yeah. Okay. So you're in Europe at this stage. You're probably mid-20s.
Yeah. I was 23 at the time.
Okay. And had things started to ease at all?
Things eased a little bit. And then, of course, I go and meet somebody else. I remember because I was at a concert with some of the other backpackers because this program was international. And so in Belgium, I was placed with 5 other people. One was from Canada, one was from France, one from Italy, and one from Poland. So it was a very eclectic group. And we went to go see a concert. And on the way back on the train, I got to talking to somebody. I just asked him what the time was, and I noticed he had an American accent. And he was half Belgian, half Hawaiian. So his dad was from Hawaii and his mom was from Belgium. So we just got to talking, and he invited me to go ziplining the next day. He was an engineering, I think geology or engineering student. And so he and his friends were going to set up their own zip line, which sounds super dodgy.
Yeah.
And I don't know why I agreed, but I'm adventurous. So I was like, sure, I'll meet with you guys and we'll go ziplining. And he was just super nice and friendly and like very, an Explore Austin kind of person, I should say. And so, we met up and we went ziplining and then that became my new sort of friend group aside from just the backpacker group.
Yeah.
And so, we hung out like most of that early summer, and then started catching feelings. And then, of course, as soon as that started happening, the same symptoms worsened, right? I was already dealing with some anxiety because I had, of course, just come out of a relationship that I had ended before I left for Europe. And so I knew it was too soon for me to like even try to be with somebody. And both of us went into it knowing it was going to be more casual and not like a long-term thing.
Right.
But that didn't seem to matter. It was like I continued having those, same symptoms. I ended up getting on medication again and going to see a psychiatrist. And I just had to like kind of cut that off. And then towards the end of my trip, I went to visit my grandparents in Portugal. And he came to visit. And I was like, okay, because at the time, like I was about to go back to the US, and like I think we both realized, okay, we have like deeper feelings than just like a one-off kind of thing. And so we were going to try to like stay in touch. And then the whole time when he came to visit, I couldn't eat. I remember right before he was about to arrive, I was at a restaurant with my grandparents and I just vomited all over the table.
Whoa.
It was bad. It was really bad. It was like paella too. So it was like all the smells and the things just kind of overwhelmed my senses.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry guys, if you don't like hearing about vomit, this is not not the episode for you.
Maybe I'll put that in a disclaimer at the start.
Yeah, exactly. We'll be talking about graphic. And so I went back to the US and we just kind of went our separate ways at that point. And yeah, I just remember being sad because I kept thinking like, man, like I met some really great people, but I can't be with anyone because my body won't let me.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, are you internalizing this at that point? Like that it's something wrong with you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I definitely thought, I was like, well, I guess I'm never getting married, and I guess I wasn't, like, actually, I think before any of the anxiety, even when I was younger, I never thought of myself as someone who's, like, gonna get married and start a big family and stuff like that. I never really had a plan. Like, I never looked that far ahead in my life. But that was around the age, right, where you start to kind of think about those things and you have broader experiences.
Right.
But yeah, and so I went back to the US. I spent 2 weeks just kind of in between projects, got acclimated, got to see my family, continued having bad anxiety. And then it was off again to go to Poland in the wintertime, which was very intense.
Yeah.
Luckily, I at least had one person there. So my Polish friend from Belgium, he and his girlfriend, now wife, were working for IKEA in Poland. So yeah, I went to live there. That was truly on my own for the first time because there were no other backpackers. It was just me. And that was a pretty powerful moment, I think, for me to recognize, like, okay, I'm pretty strong. Like, I can do this. Like, I lived abroad on my own. Yes, I had all these other people around me, but, like, I can do this. I know I can. And it was still, of course, that was not easy.
Yeah.
But I really engrossed myself in the work, and I was working on a really cool project related to employer branding. So I got to travel around to lots of different IKEA stores in Poland and interview different employees and hear what they thought about IKEA and the brand and why, what's good about it, what's bad, what do we need to change, and then basically gather those findings and report them back to the Polish kind of headquarters, essentially. Yeah. So it was a really fun project. But again, I continued to struggle with anxiety, and it kind of came to a head when I remember, like, we went out for like a team dinner, and it was at a very fancy restaurant. And I remember having to like run to the bathroom to like, and I did manage to not vomit, but I was like, it was one of those things where I couldn't enjoy the food. I couldn't enjoy anything because I was so in my head about like, am I going to vomit. Like,
Yeah.
and anytime I would go out to eat, I would feel anxious because, again, I didn't know if I would start to feel that anxiety that would cause me to, so I was always, anytime I would go out to eat, I would just like be looking for a way out, or I'd be eating something really bland that wouldn't like set me off too bad in that sense.
Yeah. And I mean, for this team dinner, was there any sort of trigger that caused this, or it was just a fact of life at that point?
It was kind of a fact of life. I think part of it was like also acclimating to a new time zone. That was really hard. When I first moved there, I got lost. So my friend picked me up from the airport, and then he dropped me off. And he was like, oh yeah, you can walk to the hotel from here, from the store. And I was like, oh yeah, that's fine. And I got lost, and I like wandered around for a bit, and then I finally got there. But it was this like tiny hotel out in the middle of nowhere outside of Warsaw. No, not a lot of people speak English there. And I was living in this like corporate apartment and all by myself. And I like went down the Facebook rabbit hole of like, oh, let me look and see what my, ex-boyfriend's doing.
Right.
So it just like, I was constantly like kind of re-triggering my anxiety by like, again, at that point, engaging in social media and like feeling that need to like check in on, well, what are other people doing? And, but with the restaurant specific example, I think I had just been feeling anxious in general. And so it just kind of, any situation where I found myself in a group setting with a lot of other people where there was the potential for my anxiety to get, or for me to vomit, I guess, it's like that would cause the anxiety in a sense. It was like a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
So
how do things wrap up in Poland?
Yeah, that's the interesting part. And this is the good part of the story. The happy ending is I kind of had this like epiphany. I had been going through therapy, and my therapist was like, she was trying to help me through it. And I think I was able to like identify some good things. I was also on medication, which helped curb some of the worst symptoms. I could finally eat better, and things were starting to look up, and I had made some new friendships, and luckily I hadn't developed feelings for anyone at that point. So I was okay for a while. And I just realized like, oh, this really traumatic thing just happened to me like a couple of years ago. At that point, I think it had been almost 5 years since David and I had broken up, in that initial period of being in the hospital and being, having mono and all those things. And I just was thinking, I was like, my brain hasn't fully processed what happened. And I haven't, like, I still feel guilty about it. I still feel guilty that I was never able to explain to David what actually happened. And so I, as one does, as a millennial, I reached out on Facebook. I like wrote this long thing. I like wrote it in a Word document, of course, initially, and then I like copy pasted. It took me a while, a lot of tears, a lot of fears and tears. And I hit send, not expecting really a response. I was like, well, let's just send it out into the ether and see what comes back, if anything.
Did you know at all like where he was in life at that point?
I had no idea.
Yeah.
I had no clue. I mean, I had followed a little bit of his, like, he wrote and made music, and he had posted some of his writing. He's a very deep and thoughtful person, and he wrote some beautiful things. And so I like kind of felt like I knew some things, but he's, it was very private too, so I didn't really know too much.
Yeah.
And so I reached out, and he responded relatively quickly, I think within a day. And he told me, thank you for reaching out, and thank you for like sharing that. And of course, like he said, like, it's not easy for me, and it wasn't easy for me to deal with what happened. But at that point in his life, when I had reached out, his best friend had just passed away from a brain aneurysm.
Wow.
So it was like very traumatic for him. And he went through, I don't want to like go into his stuff, but, he basically spent 2 years not being able to work, like not going to school, just basically isolating himself. And I caught him in that moment of isolation where he was just kind of shutting out the world. And so I think he was able to finally understand to a greater degree what I had been through, and, even though we were both experiencing different ends of the spectrum, depression, anxiety are very interrelated, but also separate things. By virtue of both going through something very traumatic, I think it enabled us to meet in a totally different place in our lives and to relate to each other finally in a much different way. And we, at that point, neither of us were, especially religious, and we had both kind of chosen a different path. And so there were just all these things that we connected over, and we were just very honest and blunt with each other. And we would like instant message back and forth. And we finally decided to just Skype, which was very nerve-wracking. But once that like initial like nerve-wracking feeling of like, oh my God, I'm going to Skype with this person I haven't talked to in 5 years, whose heart I completely broke.
Yeah.
Once that wore off and we like got to talk and like see each other in person on camera, I think a lot of those, like no real feelings necessarily came back, but I think we both felt like, oh my gosh, like I can breathe again. And so for me, that was it was just a very big moment of self-realization.
And in terms of your relationship at that point, what was the transition to dating? Did you guys restart the relationship while you were still overseas?
No. So it started off, just as friends, right? Like just getting reacquainted, really.
Yeah.
And so when I came back, we both connected a lot because I think one of the things that got me through that trauma was I had learned in high school how to play the guitar, and that was a huge outlet for me. Even though I haven't played in a long time now. Thankfully, I don't need to in the way that I used to. And so I schlepped my guitar all over Europe, and I, would like just make up my own songs and, just be really emo and sad. And my husband used to play in like the church band, and so he was always a musician and played guitar, and so we connected over making music. And so when I came back to the US, we knew we wanted to meet up and like get together, but I was very anxious still about that, obviously, because I didn't know how I would react and how my body would react. And so we picked neutral ground. We did a Harry Potter trivia night with a friend of mine from college. And I just remember like seeing him for the first time and like getting together. It was like a lot of those feelings started to come back, and it was kind of instantaneous of like, oh wow, okay, like I didn't expect that.
Yeah. And
it was very scary, and I tried to like fight that. And so I kind of like distanced myself from him for a while when I had first come back. And then he started kind of pursuing me in a bigger way and like reaching out and like just checking in. And he knew my story at that point, and he knew I still struggled with anxiety, and he was very understanding. And I think that's the reason why I love him so much, because he just let me go at my own pace. But he was always there, and he was like, and he showed me that he cared by continuing to pursue me even when I was struggling and fearful. And so then, we played music together. I remember like I was house sitting for my sister, and he came over and we played, and we like even recorded some songs that we still have on SoundCloud floating around somewhere. And yeah, I think that's when we both knew, and we were like, okay, like I think this is for real. And so we started dating in secret, and we waited 3 months to tell our families, because obviously what I went through and what we went through both was very traumatic for our families too, because his family thought I was just a mega bitch and like, oh, you just completely like broke up with him for no reason. Like,
right, because they didn't have that context.
Right, they had no context, and his sister like hated me for a long time. Very, very protective older sister. And so, yeah, we dated in secret. And I remember, again, I was house sitting and he was over, and then my sister and her husband came home early. And we were there just hanging in the kitchen, and they're like, wait, David? What? And so it was a very funny moment of like, oh, okay. So yeah, and I think at that point, again, the anxiety hadn't completely left me. It was still there in the background for sure.
That's actually what I wanted to ask about was as you guys are messaging and then talking on Skype and then reconnecting in person, how's your anxiety and nausea throughout all of that?
Yeah, I would say the anxiety was definitely there. It was lower level at that point. I feel like at that point I had learned how to cope better.
Yeah.
I had more mechanisms for coping. I also had a full-time job, and it was, pretty new to me at that point, and so I was able to like really throw myself into that. I spent a lot of time working, so that also was like kind of a distractor. But I think the fact that he was so understanding and so patient with me, it helped me feel at ease in a new way, right? I didn't feel that same, because before, when I was anxious around him, there was a sense of like him wanting to understand, so he was constantly reaching out, and like I was constantly reaching out to him to try to explain, and then I couldn't, and it was just so frustrating.
Yeah.
And I would get even more nervous when he would pursue me in the past, right? Because I had no way to explain what my body was going through. And so in this case, like, he already knew the backstory. I had already been dealing with it for 5 years at that point. And so, we just took it very slow, and we started just by hanging out, and like, we didn't do dinners together or anything like that. Like, he kind of let me dictate the speed at which things moved, and like, I would cook, or I would make a salad or something that was like easy to eat.
So it was more manageable.
It was more manageable, and I just we eased into it, and like every once in a while, like I might have like an intrusive thought or something, and I don't even know what it would be, but I would have just a reaction, and maybe I would vomit, but his reaction was always like, "You're gonna get over this. Like, it's gonna be okay." And he would just like be so calm, and that helped me feel calm.
Yeah.
In the state that I was in.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, so how long before you guys ended up engaged and then married?
Yeah, that's kind of a cool story too. I love telling the story. So the first time around, we always have to like divide now our relationship between the first time and the second time around. So the first time around, I remember for Christmas, we had both given each other a book about Iceland. And so for our 3-year dating anniversary, the second time around, again, we had gotten each other the same exact book without realizing it. And I think the part I accidentally skipped over was in my book, my version of the book, he had printed out like a fake itinerary of like, one day we'll go to Iceland together.
Cute.
And he put it in the book, and I was like, that's so sweet. And then of course we broke up, so that never happened. And then the second time around, so this would have been, I guess, 8 years after we first dated. So 5 years we didn't talk, then we started dating. 3 years in, it was our 3-year anniversary, and he gave me that book, and inside the book was plane tickets to Iceland.
Cute.
Which is like the most thoughtful thing any human has ever done for me before. and so I kind of like had a hunch. I was like, okay, I think he's gonna propose. This is the one. Because before he had gotten us tickets to Denver, and I thought for sure he was gonna propose then, but no, it was a false flag. And so we ended up going on a trip to Iceland. This would have been March 2018, and it was when the Northern Lights were supposed to be like the most active. And so we like rented a camper van, and we drove from Reykjavik down the east coast of Iceland. And I kept thinking on the trip, I was like, when the frick is he gonna propose? And
you're like, anything you want to bring up, anything you want to say?
Right, it's like David. And so I think it was like the third day, at this point it was like further away from my mind because it had been 3 days, and I was like, well, I guess it's not gonna happen, or maybe it'll be like the last day of our trip or something. So I wasn't thinking about it. He was like, oh, we should go look at the Northern Lights. And it was like 10 p.m. We had just pulled up to this like beautiful national park. And so it was us and a bunch of German tourists on the side of a road in the middle of the night looking at the Northern Lights. And of course I'm a photographer, so I was like taking a million long exposure photos trying to capture the northern lights, and I was so distracted. And he told me after, he was like, yeah, I kept trying to propose, but you were so like into taking photos. I was like, I'm sorry. And of course then my hands got freezing because I was taking a bunch of photos. So I came up to him and I like tried to put my hands in his pockets, and he was like boxing me out. I was like, what the fuck, David? I just want to put my hands in your pockets. And of course, when I did that, he couldn't keep me out. And so I felt the ring box.
Right.
And I think I didn't 100% know that's what it was. I thought maybe it was a hand warmer, but like I think subconsciously I knew, and I like blurted out so stupidly. I was like, let's get married. And so I ruined my own proposal. And so he just literally stepped back, because I told him long before that, I was like, you don't have to get down on one knee. That's so antiquated and silly. Like, just propose. It's fine. Whatever. So he just stepped back and he like took out the ring and opened it, or took out the ring box, opened it. He was like, yeah, you want to? Let's do it. So it was a very us proposal, because I literally cannot keep any secrets, or like I can't just not blurt things out. And so, yeah.
That's awesome.
That was a proposal. Yeah. So he proposed under the northern lights.
So that was 4 years ago?
Yeah. 2018.
Okay.
And then we got married in 2019 in Driftwood, and we had an unwittingly very COVID safe wedding. It was like 40 people, all outdoors. But lucky for us, we didn't have to go through that during COVID. So
yeah.
And then, was this a happily ever after story? Did the anxiety and the nausea just completely fade into the background, or is this still something that is somewhat there today?
Yeah, great question. It definitely dissipated and kind of disappeared for. I mean, I had anxiety, but it was work related, and it was stress, right? It was more cortisol coursing through my veins, because I was in a very stressful job. But I didn't really have any problems with eating. Like, occasionally I would still get nervous if we would go to like a fancy restaurant. I think because of my past experience, I would just get nervous out of nowhere, and I would be like, David, I'm fine, but also no, I'm not.
Don't
fine.
order the paella.
Yeah, exactly. Just don't do it. And so we kind of just like would do very casual date nights and stuff instead of going to like any fancy places. So that was like the remnant, I think, of the anxiety still being there, but I was honestly fine. And then COVID, obviously, 2020. And I was isolating. We took it really seriously, and so like I only saw my family, and even then we were pretty distant from each other. And so I had just started a new job like right before the pandemic, and I felt kind of out of my depth, and again a big change in my life. And so I started just feeling really stressed and down on myself, and like I was like really just badgering myself. I was like, I'm not good at this, like I can't, it was a lot of negative self-talk. And I think that brought back the stress of that experience, kind of brought back a lot of anxiety for me. It wasn't tied to our relationship at that point, but it was just, I just felt anxious all the time, and I couldn't get out of my own head. And I got to the point where I was like crying almost every day, and it wasn't like, I love my job. Like I loved the people I worked with, but I just could not get out of my own way. And so I made the decision to go into therapy, and to also get on medication, which I'm still on. And it's probably the best decision I think I've made, even though it was hard to get through that first period of like getting myself used to the, like the medication. It can take time to get the right dosage and all that.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful, because I feel like I'm finally myself. I think I've always suffered from anxiety. It's just been in the background, and it's been this like noise that's been in my head, and now it's like the noise is finally more quiet.
Right.
So
Yeah, so we are getting pretty close to wrapping. Looking back at it, is there any part that you would approach differently, or maybe advice you'd have to somebody who's maybe in the same situation?
yeah, honestly, I don't know that I would do anything differently. I mean, I wouldn't be where I am if I had done something or if I did do something differently. By the same token, I think the advice I would give is don't run away, right? The biggest and best piece of advice that I got was accept the anxiety. Like, don't let it dominate you, but acknowledge it, like sit with it, recognize that it's happening, and don't try so hard to resist it, because in the resistance, you spiral and you continue in that mental spiral. And so once I kind of figured that out, of like unlocking that, that just helped me tremendously, because it was like, okay, this thing doesn't have to have so much power over me. And of course, it's much easier said than done. It took me a long, long time, over 5 years, obviously, to figure that out.
Yeah.
But it was kind of this period of getting to a point where I was like, okay, I'm dealing with this anxiety. It's causing some physical symptoms. I'm going to like sit here. I'm going to, either distract myself a little bit with something, but I'm not going to try to just push it away. I'm going to let those thoughts just kind of flow. And I think that's a common tactic with cognitive behavioral therapy as well.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think the main piece of advice is find coping mechanisms. For me, it was playing guitar and going bike riding and rock climbing and like having hobbies that were physical outlets for me.
Yeah.
But I think the other piece is also recognizing, like, the more you resist, the more power it can have over you. And so it's also learning just how to accept that it's there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's maybe just a broader lesson for trauma for people. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of people kind of just resist these things because they don't like what it means for them, or they just don't like it being there.
Mm-hmm.
And the resisting is just exhausting.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's the battle that I think I was fighting for like 5 years, up until I finally realized, like, oh, okay, I had this very traumatic thing that happened that I didn't deal with.
Yeah.
And now that I've dealt with it, I am taking the first step, right? It doesn't mean the journey's over and I've just completely mastered things, but it means just starting to acknowledge that, just like anything, is the first step.
Yeah, absolutely.
So.
Well, I appreciate you sharing all of that. I appreciate the vulnerability and the honesty in your story. And I think there are very valuable lessons in that story that I think will help a lot of people. So I really appreciate you coming here and sharing that today.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
I hope it resonates.
Thanks, Becca.
Thanks.